My name is Laura Bell. I am a program manager with the International Association of Fire Chiefs, also a volunteer EMT with Fairfax County. And what we're going to be talking with you about today are near misses, the near miss program, what we do, where we're going, and we're also going to be talking about one of the tools to help implement culture change, and that's crew resource management, just one of the many tools that are available to help us move towards a culture of self-examination where we look at near misses.
This belongs to you.
Oh, thank you. So what is a near miss, or how do we define it and look at it? We talk about near misses being any event in which a serious injury, fatality, significant property damage, or crises was averted thanks to a fortunate break in the chain of events. And it's that break in the chain of events that we really focus on at the program. What our mission is to help reduce firefighter fatalities and injuries by helping apply those local lessons nationally, at a national level. And how do we do that? We do that by having an online reporting form to collect near misses. We then have subject matter experts who de-identify reports, and we put them back out in the form of a searchable library so that you all can learn from others' experiences. So that's what we really do at our core. So how did this whole idea come about, and why is it still important today? So back in the late 90s and early 2000s, a group of thought leaders in the fire service were really alarmed at this statistic, that the rate per 1,000 fires has remained consistent over the last 30 years at about 20%. And also the fact that line of duty deaths have remained consistent as well at about 100 a year. So they were very alarmed at this, looked at, and we heard this morning in Gordon Graham's talk, they looked at what was going on in other industries and selected the aviation safety reporting system as a model. They saw how well it worked for the aviation industry and decided, why not for the fire service? Why would this not work? So with that, in 2005, they stood up the National Firefighter Near Miss Reporting System as a means to collect near miss incidents, look at them, look for trends, look for patterns, and share them back out to the community so that others could learn. Currently, we have about over 5,000 reports in our library. They're all searchable moments. And we also develop training materials based on those near miss reports. We do this by having Report of the Week, which is essentially we select a report that we think has a particularly good learning moment, and we add discussion questions and we send it out each week. We also have other training materials that we put out. Our foundational principles, and these were the foundational principles that were used in the aviation industries, that it's,
Sorry about that, that was me.
Jeff, come on. Is that it's an anonymous process, and this is absolutely key to make it non-punitive. Voluntary, so you aren't forced to submit your report. You share near misses that you feel comfortable sharing. And also, we ensure that it's confidential, again, to maintain that non-punitive and safe environment in which you can report your near misses. This is the safety pyramid, and it illustrates the fact that we can focus on that one dramatic event, but there really is an entire spectrum to learn from. So a whole spectrum of events, unsafe acts, injuries, lost time injuries that we can look at, and we spend our time at the base of the pyramid, at those unsafe acts. And if we thought about it, this pyramid, if it were actually in proportion, it would be a lot wider. That triangle would be massive. Right, NIOSH occupies themselves with the fatality reports. We, again, focus on near-miss events. I'm gonna let Jeff.
Yeah, if you could go up and
Yep.
get ready to play that in a second. Good afternoon, my name is Jeff Snow. I am an advisor to the Near Miss program. I am an emergency preparedness and sustainability consultant. I'm also a volunteer firefighter in EMTI in Fairfax County and serve as a deputy chief at the Vienna Volunteer Fire Department. I'm also an adjunct instructor for the volunteer fire and EMS program at the Fairfax County Fire and Rescue Academy, so sometimes my perspective comes from being an instructor. One of the interesting things about near misses, and I don't know if anybody here has submitted a near miss report to the program, but when Laura first approached me about working on the near miss program as an advisor and in program development, I thought to myself, well, I've personally have never been involved in a near miss, because for me, I thought about a near miss as being something incredibly dramatic, you know, like you're making an interior attack and there's a hole in the floor and somebody almost falls through the floor or does fall through the floor. And I was like, I've never seen, like a ceiling collapse or anything like that. But as you sit and think about what you conceive of as a near miss, realize that it's not just that event where somebody was snatched from the jaws of death or just by the barest of margins avoided a serious injury. A near miss could be something where the chain was broken earlier on, where a serious injury was averted way further up because of people, good situational awareness, good teamwork, good communication. So when it comes to writing a near miss report, we've seen this again and again. Firefighters don't want to submit their experiences because it's not that worst case scenario, right? It's not that wind-driven fire that takes off. And yet, odds are good that you guys have had several experiences that would make great reports for the near miss program. So as we go through, keep that in mind. If you've got those dramatic events, fantastic, we'd love to hear about it and learn from it. But even if you don't, I'm sure there's plenty of things that everyone here could contribute to the near miss program.
It's that point.
Yeah, this video illustrates it, so let me just step to the side and you guys watch this. Most of our reports are written, but here's a video. So did you guys catch what he said? Yeah, fuel cap was off. All right. So what are your thoughts watching that video, as far from either an officer perspective, instructor perspective, fellow firefighter? What are some of the thoughts that occur to you? I heard somebody react when he got tackled kind of to do the stop, drop, and roll, right? So from the near miss perspective, we think, okay, what are the odds of this happening to any one of us might be kind of low, right? But let's at least think about what could we do to prevent this in the future that would be fairly easy to implement, right? So what would some things be that we might want to implement to prevent that?
We don't do a safety check. Pro, I guess now we got to check equipment.
Right. Now it could be like
it's a training scenario, so we're always a little bit more on our take your time. There's just got to do it right.
Yeah.
Teaching them.
Right.
Experience of the operator. If you got a brand new person who just got out of fire one and maybe had 15 minutes of holding the saw versus somebody who's proficient in the unit, there might be somebody there right beside him or her giving them some guidance rather than, okay, well, here's the prop.
Absolutely. Now, when I first watched this, I kind of had the assumption that the firefighter operating the saw was the one to fill it and didn't put the cap back on, but that might not be, right? It might be somebody else filled it, handed it off, and the guy just lights it up. Yes, sir. So in case nobody else heard that, some steel saws, difficult cap to put on, especially with fire gloves, it may be an engineering problem. So I watched this and I thought, okay, yeah, this might not, and if you remember from the morning's presentation, we do want to focus as a fire service on those events that are prevalent, like the highway accidents, right? Those are some of the big issues we run into. But even these smaller ones can provide good learning moments, right? Of maybe we do have the instructor eyeball the tool before the recruit uses it, right? And I'm not saying this would work, but I thought, well, maybe we put a little bit of high-vis tape on a gas cap, so you learn that if it's not there, you kind of hone in on it, right? I'll tell you from an instructor point of view, NFPA 1403 kind of thinking, do we practice what to do if a recruit catches clothing on fire? Because I don't really think instructors do, right? I mean, because we don't think it's going to happen. It might happen with a saw, it could happen with a burn barrel, it could happen with something else. But that's something else I thought about. You know, maybe we should just drill on how to properly, you know, not tackle a recruit perhaps. Maybe have an extinguisher nearby. So I know as a fire service, we love sharing videos like this, and from the near miss reporting system point of view, we don't just share it and kind of laugh, but we want to think about, all right, how would we handle it and make sure we don't have the same thing happen. So any other thoughts on that? All right. Now, we talked about what went wrong. We really have started to focus the near-miss reporting system on not just collecting the lessons from people, but how to apply them. Now, we're not quite there yet, and Laura is absolutely committed to making this program work for the fire service, but what we'd like to do is also talk about some of the obstacles to applying lessons, right? So you guys may figure out, whether it's that example or another one, you may figure out a really good solution, but you may have a hard time implementing it at your department for certain reasons. Sometimes it's cost, sometimes it's culture, so on and so forth. So one of the things we wanted to talk about today was one of the tools that has been incredibly successful in the aviation industry and other industries as far as reducing injuries, and that's crew resource management. I know, Laura, you could probably give a little bit better background on the tie between the IFC and the aviation industry?
Sure, no, absolutely. So when the near-miss reporting system was originally stood up back in 2004 and then launched in 2005, we had Linda Connell from NASA. So NASA is the third party that manages the aviation safety reporting system, come and participate in the working groups and focus groups that worked towards getting this program set up. And the way we look at near-miss reporting is we're learning from the past experiences of others. With crew resource management, we are leveraging real-time others' experiences and perspectives to help avert those near misses, and that's the connection. So near miss is after the fact. Crew resource management is something that you can utilize real-time to help avert accidents, but also near misses. Yeah. And that's how I like to think about it.
It's a great way to put it, and that helped really kind of focus my thinking on it. So it stems from the aviation industry, and is anybody here in the room either a pilot or an aviation buff? Anybody? Okay, thank you, sir. Chris, is that right, in the back? Okay, so if you want to expand on anything I say with this, please feel free to jump in and certainly get me back on track if I say something that's not right, because I'm not a pilot or an aviation buff. But let's talk a little bit about the similarities between aviation and the fire service, right? So on a plane, in the cockpit, small crew that works together, similar to an engine or truck company, right? Small crew with a captain in charge, or at least a lieutenant in the fire service. We are interacting with some fairly complicated equipment, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars of equipment that we need to be conversant on. Very little tolerance for errors. Certainly in aviation, zero tolerance for errors, right? And really in our line of work, the same thing. Andy Beck, another advisor for the near miss program, developed this slideshow. He's definitely a huge aviation guy, and he loves putting it this way, which is the two professions share that there can be hours of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror, right? And hopefully we're not getting to the point where we have that terror, but it's absolutely true, right? Where you can go days without anything of consequence happening, and all of a sudden things are hitting the fan, right? And we can operate in that time-compressed environment where every single moment is of the essence, and time slows down. So we do share those similarities. Now, the aviation industry went to crew resource management after its experiences over the first few decades of commercial flight, and especially after what happened on several occasions in the 1970s. Commercial aviation had a similar problem in that they had very high injury and fatality rates. 1972, I believe, was the worst year, with nearly 2,500 fatalities worldwide, with fewer flights than we have today. Much like the fire service, they tried to address this with better technology, right? So I've been in the fire service just a few months short of 9 years, not a long time. Those of you who've been a lot longer can certainly tell me some of the technological advances, right? We have better PPE, better SCBAs. Our pass alarms are now integrated with our SCBAs, right? Our rigs, better safety systems. Maybe they're governed for speed. They have backup cameras, all these things, right? But technology is not always going to solve the problem. And the aviation world saw the same thing, where maybe they had auto guidance systems and they created cockpit voice recorders and flight data recorders, but they weren't seeing a reduction in crashes. But what was cool was those flight data recorders, the flight data recorders and the cockpit voice recorders were able to give clues as to why the crashes kept happening, even with better technology, safety technology. And these 3 incidents really drove home that it was a human problem, a human factors problem, and not a mechanical problem. So I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with these crashes, but the first one, Eastern Airlines Flight 401. This was a flight that crashed in the Everglades in Florida. And in the cockpit, when the plane is coming in to land and the crew deploys the landing gear, these indicator lights should go on saying that the landing gear is down successfully. Well, a bulb was burned out in this cockpit. And the crew said, well, wait a second, is it a bulb problem? Is it something else? Is the landing gear really down? Well, they became so fixated with dealing with the wiring and the bulb that one of the crew disengaged the autopilot without noticing. And basically the plane started to descend at an almost imperceptible rate. So they thought the autopilot was keeping them level, and it wasn't. By the time they realized that it was too late to do anything about it. So a burned out bulb, and the crew focusing in on that caused a crash. The Tenerife airport disaster. So Tenerife is an airport in the Canary Islands, Spanish islands in the Atlantic Ocean. And this was sort of a confluence of bad circumstances. At one of the primary airports, a bomb went off that day, and there were threats of a second bomb. So flights were diverted to the Tenerife airport. So now you've got an overloading of planes at this small airport. As the flights are landing, as they're taxiing, a fog rolls in. Okay, so now you've got overcrowded conditions and bad weather on the ground. A KLM flight, a Dutch flight, thought it was cleared for takeoff on a runway, a fog-bound runway. They thought they were clear. The air traffic control, realizing that there may have been a miscommunication, said, no, 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 you're not clear, except that communication got stepped on radio-wise. As the KLM flight took off and reached takeoff velocity, it clipped a Pan Am flight that was sitting on the runway. So the Pan Am flight was heavily damaged, many fatalities. The KLM flight took off, and it hit the plane, took off, and then crashed. I think something like 580 people combined died in the worst aviation accident. Two of the things they realized out of that was, number one, standardized language, right? When the KLM flight said, we're ready for takeoff, they used the word takeoff saying, we're ready. The air traffic controller said, okay. Well, they thought that meant, okay, go ahead, take off. Well, it didn't. And since then, what the aviation industry did was they cleaned up their language to the point where certain words are only used in exact moments. They got everybody on the same page so that the phraseology meant the same thing. They also looked at what happened in that KLM cockpit, where some of the crew maybe had a hard time challenging the captain and didn't speak up and say, wait a second, we may not actually be cleared, right? The third flight that caused an issue was, or that caused the aviation industry to really look at human factors was United 173, which crashed in Portland. This is a case where the landing gear may or may not have deployed correctly. And the crew did the right thing. They did not try to land. They went around. As they diagnosed the problem, nobody did the calculations to determine how much fuel they would have left. So as they are troubleshooting the problem with the landing gear, they ran out of fuel and crashed. So if you think about the massive fatalities and the damage that happens by people either being distracted, by people not speaking up, the aviation industry realized something needed to change. United Airlines was the very first to implement crew resource management. One of the tenets they found was, look, the captain with often 30 years of experience is that unchallenged voice, and that needs to change to where the co-pilots can, if they see something, they need to have the ability to say something. And you know, the captain still may call the shots, but at least these things are being addressed, right? And what they tried to develop was a system to manage the error and mitigate the mistakes as it happened. A second facet of crew resource management was not that they expected their people to be 100% perfect 100% of the time, because they realized that was impossible. So they went in knowing that sometimes their pilots would be fatigued. Sometimes people would not be reading things correctly, right? So they went in with the assumption that we need to come up with a system where errors are avoided or trapped by others, and it becomes a crew, a group effort. So we can see that we can avoid errors by proper training and proper SOP. We need to be able to trap the risks by discovering them real time and adjusting real time. And that becomes, if you and I are operating on a crew together, and I'm not focusing on the bigger picture, you can tell me, hey, look, do you not notice the traffic that we haven't controlled on this roadway, or whatever the risk may be, right? And allowing your crew to have that dialogue with you as an officer. And then the third thing they wanted to do was, okay, fine, errors happen. We may not avoid all of them. We may not trap all of them, but at least let's have some protocols in place that if something does happen, we mitigate the damage. On the fire side, we could see this as sort of, okay, let's say the rig does get into a wreck. Are we at least wearing our seatbelts to mitigate the injury to ourselves? Do we at least maybe have airbag systems to mitigate the damage to ourselves, right? So that was their three-pronged approach. Avoid the error to begin with if possible, have mechanisms for trapping it, and then if that fails, at least mitigate the damage. Maybe in the aviation industry, that would be redundancy in their systems. Fine, one system is offline, we have some redundancy, right? So did it work? I believe these statistics are from the early 90s or mid-90s. This is when CRM first started to be implemented, about a decade in, and you can see the accident rate reductions are pretty significant in the military and elsewhere, both fixed-wing and rotary craft helicopters. So again, most of the errors were not mechanical, they were a human factor. This is perhaps the most famous example of crew resource management working incredibly well, even though this accident involved a number of fatalities. United Flight 232 in Sioux City, Iowa. Is anybody familiar with this example? You guys are, right? Because it's famous. You either remember it or it was taught, right? So for those of you who don't, if you think about those three cases we talked about from the 70s, where it was really minor things that led to fatalities, this was something off the charts major as far as this plane was concerned. It was a DC-10 plane, and it had a rear-mounted engine with fractures in the fan. Well, the fan basically came apart in the engine, shrapnel blew through the plane and severed all three hydraulic lines controlling all the flight controls. Okay, so all of a sudden, once the pilots take stock of their situation, they realize something bad has happened. They realize that their control columns are doing nothing. Nothing. They cannot turn the plane to the right or the left. They cannot control the altitude of the plane. So they call in and they say, okay, United, can you put us on the phone with somebody who's modeled this and how we get the plane on the ground? And what they were told was, we thought this was impossible. There's no model for how to land a plane like this. So, okay. One of their passengers, I believe his name is Dennis Fitch, right? He was riding on the plane. DC-10 instructor, right? Says to one of the flight attendants, hey, if I could be of any help, I'm a pilot and I'm an instructor. Maybe I know something about whatever it is that's going on. What did the captain do? Immediately, exactly right, Chief. The captain immediately said, bring him into the cockpit, right? Whereas maybe 15 years before, that wouldn't have happened, right? But the captain realized, this guy may know something, and if nothing else, it's an expert set of hands, right? Now, the crew didn't realize fully that they would not regain control of the flight. They kept trying through the duration of the flight, just in case there was some hydraulic pressure left that they could control the flaps. But while the crew was doing that, Fitch was given the assignment of taking the two remaining engines and throttling one up and throttling one down to at least control the orientation of the plane. So that's how they were basically steering the plane, was through throttling one engine up and idling the other. That is all they had at their disposal. They never regained control. They came in at about 100 knots faster than they should have, descending at a rate that was way higher than they should have, and they crashed in Iowa. But apparently 62% of the people on board survived, when really, I mean, this is, as it says there, a Titanic-type accident where there should have been no recovery from this. And I guess it's a legend kind of in the aviation world where, you know, running this in a simulator, people don't recover from this, really, right? I mean, if you take a second to look at this quote from Captain Haynes, the preparation that paid off for the crew was something called cockpit resource management, and that was the original name. So look at what he says here. The captain was the authority up until 1980. 103 years of flying experience in that cockpit, and nobody had any experience with this type of situation. So who was he to think that he would know best? He needed to involve everybody. Why would I know more about getting an airplane on the ground under those conditions than the other three? So if I hadn't used CRM, if we had not let everybody put their input in, it's a cinch we wouldn't have made it. So with CRM, and we're going to kind of fairly quickly go through these principles of crew resource management as it's been implemented in the aviation world and as some fire departments have started to implement it. This is just meant to sort of be an introduction, and I will say this now, I think a lot of the points on the slides that we're going to look at seem fairly obvious and seem like, oh, but we already do that. But really think about whether or not, as a company officer or as a chief level officer, if your crews are really doing this. And there's always room for improvement, right? So it's kind of as obvious as some of these things seem. Think about, like, in your particular jurisdictions, how you could better implement them. So the first tenet of crew resource management is you have to have good communication, and wherever you find these barriers to good communication, you have to eliminate them, right? Now, a lot of times we think about communication, we think technology, right? So I know in you know, where I am, in the Northern Virginia region, National Capital Region, I think most of us are fairly fortunate, right? Technology, we generally have pretty good radio systems, we've got good interoperability, right? But there are certainly jurisdictions that don't have the technology that they could use. But it's not just technology that goes into bad communication, right? I mean, what do we teach new firefighters? Paint a picture, right? Nobody's seeing what you're seeing. You have to let them know, right? And still, I think everybody at some point falls prey to assuming that other people know what they're seeing and what's going on. So think about this as we drill, and maybe that's a good way to lead about crew resource management is, as we go over some of these things, think about how you might implement these at the training level, right? So instead of just teaching recruits how to use the new radios, make sure we drill them on, are you painting a good and adequate picture of what you're seeing? But really with crew resource management, what they were finding was people weren't asking for input of others. And this is where I think I've seen, at least in my 8-9 years, I've seen a positive change, where I've seen officers ask me my opinion on what I'm seeing, or are you seeing something else? There's another slide in here that will say that one of the early criticisms of CRM was that it sounded like the officer was giving up the authority, and that's not the case at all. The officer's not. The officer is the one who is going to make the final decision. But what it is saying is the officer is going to at least solicit the input because, other pairs of eyes may be picking up something he or she is not. Not asking for thoughts is one thing. Another thing is, and kind of a corollary, I think, Laura, as you were pointing out, is not speaking up is another. And we see this a lot with newer people in the fire service, where even if their captain or their lieutenant is pretty good about getting input, there's that, maybe I don't really know, like, should I say anything about this? Maybe I don't want to, nobody else is reacting to it, right? So who am I to say that this is, this is an issue? One of the ways we can avoid that is just, making sure we don't make fun of people, right? Making sure we thank them for saying something, right? Making sure that it's okay for them to bring points to our attention. We can see some of the other things, intentionally withholding information. I really haven't seen this, and but you potentially this could be with crews who don't, for whatever reason, don't like each other. They're just, forget it, and let them do what they're going to do. Fatigue or recklessness can certainly play a role in communication. This slide talks about, this is kind of like people skills, like if you do see something that you think is a safety issue or a mission critical issue, how would you raise it to somebody in authority? And so this slide basically says, okay, hey, Cap, here's my concern. I think we've got too many people, operating in the collapse zone. So I was thinking, maybe we could pull them back or something, or just, make sure they're safe. What do you think? State the problem, state a solution, get buy-in if you can. Again, I think most people are pretty good at this, but every now and then you do see somebody who's a little bit too hard charging and comes up with what are you doing? Like kind of more aggressive approach, which usually doesn't make friends, right? So, and by the way, I know I do tend to talk a little bit quickly. Please stop me if you have any questions or any input. So task allocation. This is a really important one. We do a pretty good job of this in the fire service, right? Our truck company does truck company tasks. Our engine company does engine company tasks. We tend to assign our crews to what their specialties are, right? And this is basically saying is make sure we match up our personnel and their skills and their experience level right with whatever it is the job at hand needs, that needs doing. Make sure they're not overloaded. Make sure they have the proper resources. I like this last one. I didn't realize there was a term for this, but it's called sterile command post. And it comes from the aviation industry, which is below a certain altitude, there will be no communication in the cockpit that has nothing to do with it. All communication must be centered on the flight. Okay, you're cruising, you're not even landing or anything like that. You can talk about other things, but under a certain altitude, you are laser focused on the job at hand. Same thing for those of you who are command officers in a command post setting, right? Set the tone so that there are no other distractions other than what you need to do. If you need an aide to help you out, then set up that system where that person can be the filter. So obviously delegate tasks, don't overload anybody. We talked about not giving up your authority as a commander or as a unit officer. Okay. Now, this is kind of interesting to hone in on. Task allocation as far as knowing your own limits and knowing your crew limits. How many times do we, either career volunteer, run with the same crew day in and day out? Now, for the most part, you'd say sure, right? And I agree with that. But then, noticing around the fire station, there's a lot of people, and I don't know what the terminology is in Howard County, but in Fairfax we might say, oh, well, somebody's detailed in for the day, they're working callback, right? Somebody's out sick, we got another crew member. I see them, they'll introduce themselves, hey, how's it going? Do you want in for dinner? $5, right? Do we say, hey, we may know their qualifications, but we don't always, have that conversation of what are you comfortable doing? Or is there anything you want to work on? Let me explain how things are laid out, things like that. So have an understanding that you're not always working with the same people, and it might be a good conversation to have about what their strengths are. Another thing, connecting this to the fire service about knowing limits, I think those of us who've been through like a air management class, with the guys in Seattle who started doing that years ago, if you're operating on the interior, your crew is limited by the person who's sucking down their air at the fastest rate, right? So you yourself may be able to do a lot of work on a cylinder, but it's that the limiting factor may be that one person in the crew. So keep that in mind if you have somebody who uses a lot of air, things of that nature. Again, does a lot of this sound like common sense? Order what you might need early. I mean, this is what we're taught to do, right? So I kind of think, and you guys tell me what you guys think on this, we can do a lot towards reinforcing this culture, right? So if an officer, on an investigation, strikes a box alarm, or somebody else says, hey, can you start a second alarm assignment, right? Sometimes you'll hear other people kind of make fun of them for maybe jumping the gun too early, right? So if we think about, do we want to reward people who are at least being cautious, or do we want to, words can make it, how we react to certain things can really make a difference in the message we're sending, right? So when it comes to teamwork, I think we've all probably seen these things from time to time, no matter what side, whether we do this as a career or whether we volunteer our time. we do run into some firefighters who have a problem with authority. We do run into some firefighters who have that impulsive and vulnerable attitude, right? What kind of effect does that have on our crews? Chaos. What?
If you have an inexperienced crew and you just have to listen to the officer on the radio, and I'm going down the street in my buggy and I hear this high-pitched tone that tells me this is not going to go good, or 101's on the scene, you got nothing shown, have the other units take their signs because we'll be investigating. It's like, okay.
Calm, cool, collected, right?
Understand what's going on.
Right. So, you've got, some of it's experience, some of it's youth, some of it's people being in positions, maybe a little earlier than they should be, right? Good leadership can certainly, play a role in reining people in, or even just, whatever it is, just saying, hey, listen, you did well in the details. Well, let's talk about the tone, because you're sending a different message with that radio report. Here's the thing that, and again, you look at these slides and you're like, well, this is obvious, right? But again, really think hard about, do we do this on a daily basis? Or maybe we did this with people who used to be on our shift, but then there's a new person and we're maybe not as good about it, right? Are the duties clear, right? Do people have an understanding of their expectations? What do you expect them to do? What do you expect them to know on both a daily basis and on calls? And what I'm finding in talking to people is people are like, holy cow, I thought I was being clear and I really wasn't, Generally people react well to knowing what's expected of them because that's how they're going to be judged. Constructive feedback doesn't mean not critical, right? It just means, hey, to me constructive feedback means here's something that will help you be a better firefighter or a better EMT, right? Doesn't mean that it's not, hey, you could do A, B, C, and D better, but it's at least, trying to move that person into a better place, right? Train consistently, show humility, be motivated in doing the job well. And I know these are, these are always thrown up there, but it's a good reminder that these are the things that really build a good cohesive team. Are there anything else that you guys would throw up there for teamwork that you found that either really build up a team or
the 26 weeks of recruit class, that they're going to be able to come back and go up on the roof and open a roof.
Right.
And the experience level is just not there.
Yep.
And depending on what programs within the organization, how do we mentor them? Are they willing to ask questions, or in some cases, are they cowboys? I've been there. I've got 2 hay bales and 6 pallets under my belt, and I'm an experienced firefighter.
Yeah, we have a term for them called 220s.
That's correct.
Right?
That's
so you guys
correct.
have the same term, 2 years in, 20 years experience, right?
Or
So-
.comers.
.comers.
They read firehouse.com, and they can tell you all the language, but when you get on the
Right.
scene, it's like they
Right.
can't do it.
Glaze over, deer in the
Yeah.
headlights, right? Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
The leader has to be willing to do the very menial task, too.
Ah, excellent. So the leader is not above doing the firehouse chores, not above doing the grunt work if necessary, right? That's an excellent point. Anything else? I'm going to talk a little bit more about experience in a few slides, because I think that's going to become a bigger and bigger issue, or already is a big issue in the fire service. Critical decision making. So Andy Beck, like I said, the gentleman who developed this, Laura and I kind of like this slide because he compares on the left side traditional decision making as we might see in the corporate world or maybe somewhere else. All right, well, let's see. We have a problem. Okay, what's the risk to our organization? What resources do we have? And let's get some solutions. We'll get some bids. We'll get some contractors on this, and we'll select the best result and go with it. Right? That's a pretty solid plan. We'll have some reports. We'll have some PowerPoints as we do this. Right? We'll have a stack of paper at the end. Right? What they find is that in the fire service we tend to make decisions a little differently, which is recognition prime decision making. And what this basically means.
Leaders make decisions like that.
Effective leaders, yeah. So recognition prime decision making is, okay, what am I seeing right now? And what in my experience does this look like? What worked or didn't work back then, and how can I apply that now? So they have this, and I think and they quickly can deploy a plan, and I think over here on this slide, it's kind of nice. It says you have a hard drive or a tray of slides to rely upon when you're fighting that fire or when you're running that hazmat call on the highway. You're starting to look through your mental Rolodex or your card file and pull from those lessons and apply them, right? So we pick up on the cues, we think about what we're seeing, how it's similar, how it's different, and then we act. Does that sound reasonable? Yes, Chief.
Yes. I'm just going to say that I teach that's part of, I teach management.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that I really key in on when I'm talking about decision making and how they found this out. I mean, they were actually trying to figure out what officers in Vietnam, company platoon officers, how their decision making, and well, the war was over. So the closest thing they could come to was an officer in FDNY. And they studied the officers in FDNY, and they found out that's how they got that. I mean, we get on the scene, we look at it, we process it quickly. Have I seen this before? What did I do? Did it work out? I'm doing that again. And we implement. And
So it's
then,
gut decisions, right?
Right, yeah. Or if it didn't go good, well, wait a minute. Maybe I need to back up, assess, and I'll do something different than what was done last time. So I really like that.
Right. So, Chief, you mentioned FDNY, right?
Yes.
So I grew up in New York. Is anybody else from New York? Okay. So I grew up in New York in the late 70s and early 80s. So when I was a little kid, the nightly news was fire. I mean, multiple alarm fires, right? I had an uncle who was in the FDNY. My dad was in the insurance business, so I'd often, afterwards, I mean, that was way different times where you could take your 5, 6, 7-year-old kid to a burned out house really an hour after it was put out and, start doing the insurance, the law statements, right? And there'd still be firemen walking around, right? The reason I bring that up is, we look back on that time, especially in the Bronx in the 1970s, but also through other parts of New York and New Jersey. We think about Detroit as being analogous to that time period, right? These were crews that got immense levels of experience on the suppression side, right? And maybe Detroit is that level now, but I think this is going to be a real issue going forward for the fire service because for those of us like where I am, our buildings are newer. They're built to code. They've got smoke detectors. They've got sprinkler systems. They've got extinguishers. They have a population that's maybe a little better educated about, being safe fire-wise, right? So we are seeing fewer significant fires, or at least the fires that start are dampened down in their incipient stage, right? And what's another factor in our experience level? Safe staffing, right? Now we've got more engines, perhaps, going to a fire than we ever did before. We're throwing more firefighters, so my chances of being that firefighter on the nozzle are a lot lower than they probably used to be, right? And I had this was just a neat conversation. I had a conversation a few years ago with Chief Glenn Gaines, who's the Deputy Administrator at the U.S. Fire Administration, and he's from my neck of the woods as far as the fire side, Fairfax County, and he's a great guy. We were catching up, and he said that, he goes, he's a very, very humble guy, and he did say, based on my experiences in the 70s, I wrote a book on fires in garden apartments. And I said, Chief, I don't know that any of our firefighters, maybe a few at a few stations in our county would have the experience level to do that. And it's not a knock on them. It's not. It's just the reality of 80% of our calls are medical, and our fire calls are mostly alarms. Right?
And Jeff, this is where collecting
Yes.
near misses can help fill that gap, right?
This is absolutely one of the things that I'm excited about with the near miss program, which is if we do have this system where we rely on our past experience, the new firefighters are going to have a hard time ever getting to that level. But if we can tap into the experience of our colleagues and those people who went before us, start to distill those lessons, that I think is really key. It's going to be really key. And one thing I would love for jurisdictions to start doing this, which is, and we have a program in Fairfax called the Drop for our career people, when they're just about to retire. I would love for those people to be encouraged to write their calls in the near miss system. you know, or even to have the recruits interview some of these guys and say, tell me about some of the fires you've been on. Tell me about what you learned, right? So going forward, I think, I mean, is what I'm saying making sense to you guys? Are you guys seeing these trends up here as well? Okay.
You have a situation where those experienced people are going out the door for various reasons. The organization, I don't feel they treat me right, I'm going out the door, and you got the younger guy who goes, well, how about that? Learn yourself. I learned it, you need to learn.
But we're not going to be able to do that because 80% of the run, you're more likely to apply a splint on somebody's arm than to pull the 1 3/4 and flow a lot of water.
Absolutely.
And the other part of the experience factor is we learned the hard way, and some people don't want to pass that on. And that's a real shame. It's a real shame.
Yeah, and the more we can do to encourage some of the guys who, the men and women who are on their way out to share those lessons, the better. So not only is this a role for the near miss program, I think, but it's also why crew resource management might be key in the future, because maybe I'm just a bucket firefighter, but maybe I've seen something which my officer that day has not seen, right? And we can sort of share our experiences. So yeah, experience, great if we have it. We need to share it. Train like we play, and I think we as a fire service are actually doing a pretty good job of becoming more, at least what I've seen, becoming more readily accepting of training from other parts of the country. There's some really great seminars that are out there. And obviously communication and pre-planning can help us in our decision making. Situational awareness. This is the one that every seminar hits on, right? Situational awareness is absolutely key to keeping our people safe, right? We see it on our side at IAFC as the #1 contributing factor in the near misses that get submitted to us. This definition is kind of neat, I think. Situational awareness can be seen as the ability of a person or a group to keep their sense of what's going on, to keep their own sense of what's going on in tune with what really is happening, right? And the closer those two are, the better, right? So this is, would you mind playing that? You guys seen this? You know what's going to happen here? Yeah, well, that guy almost bought it, the guy heeling the ladder, right? He had to move out of the way. That's a simple example of situational awareness. And I like the guy at the end who's like, what? Guy on the right. He's like, really? Seriously? Now, that doesn't even look like those guys up there were really stressed out, right? This isn't like, they've got that adrenaline rush tunnel vision. But what do we, here are the factors on poor situational awareness. We see distraction, right? Flashing lights are distracting somebody from noticing that they're stepping into the roadway, which hasn't been controlled yet, right? People fixated on a task. They get that tunnel vision, blinders. Maybe they're overloaded with stuff. We do see some people who are complacent, or they're bringing the wrong procedure, the wrong gear to the situation. Key thing to remember about situational awareness is incident commanders and supervisors also have their own situational awareness of the incident as a whole, right? So situational awareness is not just for those of us who are, doing the actual tasks. Situational awareness of the entirety needs to be emphasized at the command and at the command level and in the post. So their job is obviously look at everything and keep everybody else safe. Now, one thing Laura and I, as we've talked about situational awareness, those of you, any instructors here? Any? Okay. So when I sat through Instructor 1 and Instructor 2, there was something I kind of had a hard time wrapping my head around, which was, we talked about, so when you go through the instructor classes, and probably a lot of you have if you're officers, remember there's the domains of learning, right? The first two are kind of easy to understand. There's the psychomotor skills, your hands-on skills, right? That's easy to understand, and most of what we do is hands-on skills. Some people are better at it than others, so on and so forth. Then there's the cognitive skills, right? Book learning, academic skills, things like that, right? Those two are easy to understand. There was that third one, and it was called the affective domain. And that was the one that said, well, you may know the right thing to do, you may be able to do the right thing, but do you have the wisdom, the maturity to actually do it, right? Do you have the ability to see what you should be doing? And that was, that was sort of fuzzier at least, but we do see some recruits like that, right? With situational awareness, I think sometimes when we talk about situational awareness, we think of it as we have blinders on, right? And if we simply remove the blinders, if we simply stop the tunnel vision, we will see the threats, right? But what happens when we have firefighters who are taking in everything and don't recognize what they're seeing as a threat? Do you see the difference? What happens when you have a firefighter who doesn't recognize that smoke pushing out at that volume and that velocity means something? Or when they see cracking in concrete, that might be a changing condition that somebody should know about? What happens when you have a firefighter who doesn't realize that it is a threat to be going down the road with unsecured tools in the rig, right? So part of situational awareness, at least as we were going through these reports, is not just getting past the heart pumping, the adrenaline, that tunnel vision. It's training our firefighters and our recruits to recognize threats, right? How often do we do a scenario where we evaluate, where we say to the person, tell me what you're seeing and tell me what right here is going to hurt you? And I don't think we usually do that, but it is something we might want to think about doing, because when we read these reports, we see time and again where a firefighter goes up to a house and almost steps on the power line that's downed and still energized because they didn't even realize this was a potential threat, right? It's not that they had tunnel vision, they just didn't know enough to think about that. Does that make sense? That it's not just the tunnel vision part, it's even understanding what is out there and can hurt us that we're seeing time and again in these reports. Last part of CRM is a good debrief. Debrief is a learning process, should be part of, basically, every incident, every call. Anybody have good experiences with this? Good debrief, we call them tailboard exercises, right? What are some of the good things that come out of this? Yes, sir.
One of the things is that, again, you have younger people, those of you work in fire station, you get to take them inside and explain to them, well, you see why the heat burned off the bottom part of the door rather than the top part of the door because it's come up the open stairwell. You see why we tell you, the book tells you one way to throw the ladder, but the street way is you come up underneath the windowsill, so if you had to come out of there, the ladder would be right there. So it's those, and then even to get back in the firehouse. And the younger folks like to hear that kind of call.
Yeah,
They do.
absolutely.
It's fun.
Absolutely, yeah. One of my first runs out of fire school, I was with an officer, Derek Rowan, who he had been on Task Force 1, Virginia Task Force 1. He had been to Katrina, been to Oklahoma City, experienced guy 20 years in, and I'll never forget this. We ran a Smells and Bells, and we played it like it could be something, and he said to all of us in the rig after we had taken up, and he said, he asked us, what could I have done better? And I sat back and I was like, this is a guy with, like, who am I? I'm just out of school, and he's asking me, what could I have done better? Which I thought was a really neat thing to at least solicit the input. Tell me what I could have done better. Tell me what went right, 3 up and 3 down. Give me 3 things that worked. Give me 3 things that we can do better as a crew. It took a lot of, humility for an officer to say that. But a really solid debrief shows, that you care about their perspective, you care about their learning, and that you really want that crew to operate strongly into the future. You can do, what did we plan to do? What actually happened? Why did this happen? What can we do the next time? Doesn't have to be a long AAR. So takeaways, if you look at this presentation again, you'll see communications, task allocation, teamwork, all these things. But this has had a major impact in reducing aviation accidents. And I think probably most of the people in this room and most of the people who are attending this symposium probably implement a lot of these already, but take a look at what take a look at the other ones from time to time and implement them to the best of your ability. And I think Laura, in the last few minutes we have, we'll talk a little bit about how near miss ties into all this.
Absolutely. This is my little reminder of what can the near miss program hopefully provide you? And that is a database of experiences that you can draw on for homework assignments, for your classes, for research, provide case studies to enhance learning. We do some trend analysis. We look at the reports coming in, hopefully put that back out to you. And again, we are a free online training resource for you. And you can always call me, let me know if you have a certain subject or topic that you're looking for reports on, and we can pull them through the database and provide them back out to you. There's a lot that we can do to help you implement culture change within your departments. And then what can you do for the near miss program? This is my favorite part of the presentation. Encourage your crews to share their experiences, not only amongst themselves in debriefings, but also with us in the program. And the image here, I like this one. I like to think about us as being kind of a national level tailboard, where you can have those tailboard talks. So encouraging people to submit their reports, encouraging crews to visit the site at the beginning of each shift, adding firefighternearmiss.com to your favorites, Firehouse, subscribing to Report of the Week, and we'll send out our weekly email. And then again, we encourage you to take part and leverage the resources that we put out there. And this is how you can contact me. Again, if you have questions, if you would like for us to pull reports for you, if you need any help in navigating the online reporting tool, we're always happy to do a webinar to talk you through how to do that, and we like feedback. So please, I always look for feedback too.